Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to St. Mary Mead, a quiet English village where roses climb the cottage walls, gossip drifts like smoke from the teapots, and beneath the surface of everyday life lies the possibility of mystery. Tonight's tale is titled Miss Marple and the Poison Jam at Rosewood Cottage. Settle in with a warm cup of tea, perhaps a slice of toast with jam, though after this story you may regard that particular delicacy with new suspicion. Chapter 1. A Summer Afternoon at Rosewood Cottage. The July sun lay gently across the little village of St. Mary Mead, turning the roses along the cottage walls into flames of pink and scarlet. It was one of those days when the air was full of bees, the sound of their drowsy humming carrying across gardens, mingling with the soft clatter of teacups and the laughter of children at play. From her neat parlor window, Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, the click of her needles a quiet accompaniment to the day's serenity. At 80 years of age, Jane Marple had seen more of life than most. Her hair was as soft and white as the clouds drifting above the church tower, and her eyes, shrewd, clear, and kindly, missed very little of what passed in the village. Some dismissed her as a simple old lady who enjoyed her garden and her knitting. Others, wiser, knew that her mind was sharper than any solicitor's, and her observations more reliable than the police reports in the county. On this particular afternoon, however, Miss Marple's thoughts were not of mysteries or of mischief. She was thinking only of whether her roses ought to be pruned before the fete, and whether young Tommy Hewitt would win the three-legged race again this year. That is, until a brisk knock rattled her front door, followed almost immediately by the appearance of Miss Hartnell, the doctor's sister, whose face was alight with gossip. "My dear Miss Marple," Miss Hartnell exclaimed breathlessly, "you have not heard? Poor Harriet Davies has taken a terrible turn, collapsed in her garden, right in the middle of her tea party. They've sent for Dr. Hayden's cousin, though I dare say she came more for Harriet's purse than her company." Having delivered her morsel of scandal, Miss Hartnell departed as swiftly as she had arrived, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She resumed her knitting, but the needles clicked with greater energy now, her mind already weaving connections as intricate as the stitches in her work. It was not that Miss Marple relished tragedy. Far from it. She was deeply saddened to think of Harriet Davies, a woman of cheer and bustling energy, now struck down in the very midst of her hospitality. But Miss Marple also knew, with the unerring certainty of long experience, that such things did not happen by accident. And if poison had found its way into Harriet's jam, then someone seated at that very tea table, had intended it so. By the time Miss Marple rose to make herself a fresh pot of tea, her mind was already turning over the names of those who might have wished harm upon Harriet Davies. Later that evening, news came more formally. Dr. Haydock himself called upon Miss Marple, partly out of professional courtesy, partly because he valued her calm understanding of human frailty. He was a kindly man, brisk in manner, with a keen sense of humor, though at the moment his face was solemn. It was quick, he told her gently, setting his cup upon her side table. Poor Harriet would hardly have known what happened. I found traces of cyanide in the remains of her jam. It was confined to the blackcurrant jar. a special batch she was most proud of. Only Harriet partook of it? Miss Marple asked quietly. The doctor nodded. She helped herself to rather a generous spoonful. The others preferred strawberry or gooseberry. I suppose one might call it bad luck. But I do not care for coincidences of that kind. Nor do I, murmured Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock sighed. The police will take it from here, of course. Inspector Craddock is hedgerows. Beneath the polite nods at the post office and the cheerful greetings in the grocer's, there ran currents of envy, resentment, fear, and longing. Harriet Davies had not been struck down by fate. She had been struck down by someone's hand. And in that small, self-contained gathering at Rosewood Cottage lay the answer. She thought back to Harriet herself, a sturdy woman, fond of her comforts, proud of her housekeeping, and not a little given to boasting of her culinary skills. She had been generous in her way, but also sharp of tongue, and with a knack for finding fault where none was sought. There were many who might have found her difficult, even insufferable, though Miss Marple herself had always felt a degree of fondness for the woman's bustling energy. Still, it would not do to pretend that Harriet had no enemies. Clara Wilton, her younger cousin, had long depended upon Harriet for financial assistance, and Harriet was not the sort to give without constant reminders of her generosity. Mr. Leonard Barnes, her neighbor, had been known to quarrel with her over boundary hedges and the noise of her chickens. The Reverend Pritchard, though mild-mannered, had once hinted that Harriet's manner at parish meetings was far from charitable, and Lydia Trent, the lodger, had confided to more than one villager that Harriet was threatening to raise her rent beyond what she could afford. A small gathering, a locked pantry, a poisoned jar. The picture was beginning to form in Miss Marple's mind, though many pieces were yet missing. She knew Inspector Craddock would tread heavily, as policemen often did, gathering statements and examining cupboards. But she also knew that truth often lay not in the cupboards, but in the quiet expressions on people's faces, in the careless remark, in the very tone of a sigh. As evening deepened, Miss Marple lit her lamp, poured herself a modest supper of soup and bread, and settled once more with her knitting. But her mind was not on her stitches. Instead, she was replaying every scrap of conversation she had ever overheard concerning Harriet Davies and her beloved jams. There had been that moment in the grocer's, when Mrs. Price declared that Harriet's blackcurrant, St. Mary Mead, it is never by chance. Outside, the summer evening faded into a gentle twilight, the sky turning rose and violet above the church steeple. The air was fragrant with honeysuckle and the first sweet notes of night-scented stock. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once more, then fell silent. Miss Marple rose, closed her curtains, and placed her knitting neatly upon its basket. Tomorrow, she knew, the village would be filled with whispers, with suspicions and speculations. The police would question, the neighbors would gossip, and beneath it all the truth would lie, waiting patiently to be uncovered. And Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle manner, would be there, watching and listening, until the moment came when the threads could be drawn together into a pattern, the pattern of human nature, which she knew so well. Thus the mystery of the poison jam at Rosewood Cottage had begun. Chapter 2. The Guests at the Garden Table. The morning after Mrs. Harriet Davies' sudden and tragic death dawned bright and fair, with a pale blue sky stretched like clean linen above St. Mary Mead. Yet for all the loveliness of the day there lingered in the air a sense of unease, a disquiet that clung about the hedgerows and followed the villagers into their daily errands. Death, particularly death of so startling a nature, had cast its shadow across the village, and there was no corner of St. Mary Mead untouched by whispers. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price confided to Mrs. Clement that she herself had once refused a jar of Harriet's gooseberry, on account of it looking peculiarly cloudy. At the post office, Mr. Simmons speculated loudly on whether Harriet had enemies, until Miss Hartnell silenced him with a look of such sternness that even he, not usually one to hold his tongue, retreated into grumbling silence. In the churchyard, the verger shook his head and muttered darkly that nothing good ever came of pride in one's preserves. Into this atmosphere of gossip and conjecture came Inspector Craddock, summoned from the county constabulary. He was a tall man with a brisk manner, a neatly pressed, but nothing more remarkable. She was proud of her constitution, as she was proud of most things. And you heard nothing unusual before the incident? Miss Marple shook her head. I was not present, you understand. I rely only upon what others have told me. Yet I do think, Inspector, that people are often less careful in their remarks than they imagine. Small things, a sigh, a complaint, a preference, these can tell one a great deal. Craddock gave a faint, skeptical smile, closed his notebook, and rose. Thank you, Miss Marple. We shall be interviewing the guests who attended the tea party. With luck, the truth will not be long in coming to light. Miss Marple inclined her head, but as the inspector departed, she thought to herself, the truth is rarely found where men in uniforms look for it. It is far more likely to be revealed by the turn of a phrase or the flicker of an eye. Later that afternoon, Craddock gathered the principal witnesses at Rosewood Cottage, the scene still unnervingly neat, as though Harriet herself might bustle in at any moment with another tray of scones. The garden table remained set beneath the striped awning, its cups and saucers cleared, but the faint sticky trace of jam still lingering on the cloth. A sense of intrusion hung in the air, for it is a curious thing how a home, once the heart of laughter and comfort, may so quickly become a place of suspicion. The inspector seated himself with authority and called upon each guest in turn to recount their observations. Miss Marple, having been invited at Clara Wilton's urging, for Clara believed her elderly cousin's neighbor would lend her some quiet support, sat quietly at the edge of the gathering, her needles moving rhythmically as her eyes, calm and watchful, rested upon each face. Mr. Leonard Barnes spoke first. A retired solicitor of 60, he was a man of sharp features, a thinning crown, and an air of perpetual irritation. He lived next door to Harriet, and had often locked horns with her over matters both great and small: the boundary hedge, the noise of her poultry, the smoke from his bonfires. He addressed the inspector with brusque impatience. Harriet's cousin. Clara was a woman of 30, pretty in a somewhat faded way, with anxious eyes and a nervous manner. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap as she spoke, her voice trembling. I cannot believe Harriet is gone. She could be difficult, yes, but she always meant well. She was kind to me, really she was. Without her, I don't know what will become of me. Her gaze darted to Inspector Craddock with an expression that was both appealing and fearful. And the jam, Mrs. Wilton, did you eat it? I had a little gooseberry. I never cared much for blackcurrant either. It was Harriet's favorite, though. She always said it was her best. Clara's eyes filled with sudden tears. I cannot think why anyone would wish her harm. It must have been an accident, surely it must. The Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat as he was called upon. A tall, gaunt man in his 50s, he possessed a manner of weary patience, as though he bore the burdens of the entire parish upon his shoulders. "I fear I can add little, Inspector. I attended out of courtesy, for Mrs. Davies was a regular contributor to our church bazaar. She pressed me to try the gooseberry, which I did, though my tastes do not particularly incline toward sweets. She seemed in good spirits until the moment she collapsed. It was quite dreadful." "You noticed nothing unusual about the jam?" The Reverend shook his head gravely. "Only that it was very sweet. Too sweet, perhaps. Mrs. Davies had a habit of overindulging in sugar. It is a sin we are all prone to in one form or another." Finally, Miss Lydia Trent was questioned. She was a young woman of about 26, plain but pleasant, with earnest brown eyes and a tendency to blush whenever attention was directed upon her. She had been Harriet's lodger for nearly 2 years, teaching at the local school. I hardly know what to say," she faltered. "Mrs. Davies had been kind enough to let me a room when I first came to the village. But lately she had spoken of raising my rent possession." She noticed how Mr. Barnes paused by the pantry door with a scowl, muttering under his breath about slovenly housekeeping. She noticed the Reverend's solemn disapproval of Clara's display of tears, and Lydia's guilty glance at the garden seat where she and Harriet had quarreled only last week. Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the lanes lined with honeysuckle and elderflower, her mind replayed the afternoon. It was not in the bold statements that truth revealed itself, but in the smallest things. A hesitation, an eagerness to disclaim, a remark too hastily spoken. Mr. Barnes's irritation, Clara's anxiety, Lydia's trembling protest, the Reverend's pious detachment. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, more patient than any inspector, would in time weave those threads into a pattern, for she knew, as she had always known, that murder in a small village was not some grand, impersonal act. It was the outcome of very ordinary human weaknesses: greed, envy, fear, or pride. And so, as the evening bells rang across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple set her mind to watch, to listen, and above all, to wait. For sooner or later, human nature would betray itself. And when it did, she would be ready. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The morning after Inspector Craddock's formal questioning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a world unchanged in appearance yet curiously altered in spirit. The roses still clambered over cottage walls. The blackbirds sang from the hedges, and the church clock chimed its steady quarters. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life, ran a current of speculation and gossip as lively as the brook that gurgled through the meadows. For the death of Harriet Davies was no ordinary passing. Sudden deaths always provoked chatter, of course. A stroke here, a heart complaint there. But poison was something different altogether. Poison, whispered over bread counters and through garden gates, spoke of malice, of intent. It must have been done in the kitchen itself. And you know what that means. His eyes rolled dramatically, and the little knot of listeners leaned closer, eager for the conclusion. Miss Marple, who was selecting her tea biscuits with calm deliberation, interjected gently. It means, Mr. Simmons, that one must be careful not to jump to conclusions. Poison is a method chosen for its subtlety, and subtlety, I have observed, is rarely accompanied by foolish carelessness. The group fell silent at her words. There was something in Miss Marple's quiet voice, some authority born of long acquaintance with human folly that silenced even the most avid gossips. Mrs. Price pursed her lips, muttered something about only saying what everyone was thinking, and busied herself with a packet of flour. Miss Marple paid for her purchases, slipped them into her basket, and departed into the sunshine. She had no wish to quash the village chatter entirely. Indeed, she relied upon it. For gossip, in her experience, was like the wind scattering seeds. Most fell on barren ground, but now and then one landed true, and from that seed a clue would grow. At the post office, she paused to purchase stamps. Mr. Simmons, behind the counter, could not resist continuing the topic in a lower voice. Of course, between ourselves, Miss Marple. If you ask me, the young schoolmistress had the most to lose. Miss Trent, that is. Harriet was forever threatening to put her rent up. And you know what lodgers are. Never satisfied, always feeling imposed upon. I dare say she resented it enough to. Miss Marple looked at him mildly. I think you will find, Mr. Simmons, that resentment is a rather common commodity. Most of us harbor it now and then, but murder requires something a little stronger. Leaving him abashed, she continued on her way. In the churchyard she encountered Miss Trent herself, speaking earnestly to the verger as she stood near the path lined with yews. Lydia Trent looked pale. Her dark hair drawn back severely, her hands twisted. Stillness that lingers when a place once full of life has been suddenly emptied. Clara Wilton answered the door, her eyes red from weeping. She had been staying at Rosewood since the tragedy, overseeing the household affairs with the air of one uncertain of her role, yet unwilling to relinquish it. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief. "Do come in. It is such a comfort to have a friendly face. Everything feels so strange without Harriet bustling about." Miss Marple allowed herself to be shown into the parlor, where the heavy curtains were drawn, and the faint scent of roses mingled with the lingering sweetness of jam. "I suppose the police have been most thorough," Clara said anxiously. "Turning out cupboards, asking endless questions. Inspector Craddock has been kind enough, but it is also distressing. And of course, people will talk. They always do." "Yes, indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "It is the way of small communities. Yet talk can sometimes bring to light what would otherwise remain hidden." Clara clasped her hands nervously. "You do not think, you cannot believe, that anyone here in St. Mary Mead would have done such a thing, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "Human nature is much the same everywhere. One must never say never. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual at the tea?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing at all. Harriet was in her element, showing off her jams. She laughed when Mr. Barnes teased her about the blackcurrant, saying it was fit for the fairies themselves. I thought she seemed perfectly well until the dreadful moment." Her voice caught. "I cannot bear to think of it." Miss Marple patted her hand comfortingly, though her own thoughts were less tender. Mr. Barnes teasing about the blackcurrant, and yet he had been so quick to disclaim any liking for it. A curious inconsistency. Leaving Clara with murmured words of sympathy, Miss Marple stepped quietly one time or another. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly. "Yet there is something to be learned, I think, from the freshness of the smudge. It seems to me recent." The inspector gave her a skeptical glance but said no more. He was, Miss Marple reflected, a capable man, but like many in his profession, he relied too heavily on formalities and too little on the subtler patterns of behavior. That evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage with her knitting in its basket and her shopping neatly put away, she considered all she had heard. In the space of a single day she had gathered a wealth of fragments. Clara's anxiety, Lydia's fear, Barnes's contradiction, the Reverend's detachment. Each on its own was trivial, but together they suggested that Harriet Davies, bustling and boastful as she had been, had stirred up more discontent than most villagers cared to admit. It would be a mistake, she thought, to view the poisoning as an isolated act. It was the culmination of threads woven long before, threads of quarrel, envy, and grievance. To find the poisoner, one must follow those threads back to their source. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, intended to do precisely that. As the twilight deepened and the first stars pricked the sky, she sat by her lamp with her needles clicking and her mind busy. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay hushed beneath the summer night. But beneath the hush the whispers continued, weaving themselves into the fabric of the mystery. And Miss Marple, listening with the ear of long experience, heard them all. Chapter 4. Shadows of Motive. The following day dawned bright and clear, a morning so serene that it seemed almost irreverent to be thinking of death at all. The roses in Miss Marple's front garden glowed in shades of blush and crimson, the bees hummed industriously, and from the distant meadows drifted the faint bleating of lambs. Yet even amid this peace, the question of Harriet Davies's untimely end threaded through the village like ivy clinging to a wall. Miss Marple, seated by her front window with her knitting basket in easy reach, reflected that there was much still to learn. Distracted air. His study, lined with sober books and faintly scented with pipe tobacco, bore the marks of recent untidiness. Papers were stacked in uneven heaps, and a half-written sermon lay abandoned on the desk. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, offering her a seat, "it is good of you to call. I fear the village is in something of an uproar. Poison in St. Mary Mead. I should hardly have credited it. I thought you might feel the burden of it, Reverend," Miss Marple said gently, seating herself. "The flock depends upon its shepherd in such times. And perhaps, if I may be so bold, you might share with me some impressions of the late Mrs. Davies. I did not know her nearly so well as you." The Reverend leaned back, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Davies was a capable woman. Too capable, some might say. She had strong opinions, never hesitated to express them, and rather enjoyed ruling her household and neighbors alike. Many admired her energy. Others, I think, found her overbearing. She was not universally loved, Miss Marple, though in fairness, I doubt she cared very much whether she was loved or not." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet she inspired confidences. I have often thought that the most commanding personalities are those to whom people reveal the most unexpected secrets." The Reverend smiled ruefully. "You are shrewd, as ever." Yes, there were occasions when Mrs. Davies brought to me matters that troubled her. Of late, she was preoccupied with her cousin Clara's financial mismanagement. She hinted at drawing up a new will, though whether she had done so I cannot say. And she spoke once, only once, of a quarrel with Mr. Barnes regarding the boundaries of their adjoining gardens. But that seemed a trivial matter of a rose bush and an encroaching fence. Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. Trivial quarrels, I have found, can take on the weight of mountains when pride is involved. A rose bush may sometimes conceal a dagger. The Reverend looked startled, then chuckled. Marple, he called, with a joviality that seemed a trifle forced. Fine day, isn't it? Quite a turn of events with poor Mrs. Davies, eh? I never would have thought it. Never. Indeed, said Miss Marple pleasantly, though I recall you once telling Mrs. Davies that her blackcurrant jam was fit for the fairies. And yet I heard you say elsewhere that you did not care for it. Barnes colored slightly. Oh, that. Well, you know how it is. One says things to be polite. Harriet was proud of her jams, always boasting of them. Best not to offend. Quay so, said Miss Marple, her eyes resting on him kindly. Best not to offend, and yet sometimes one finds oneself doing so despite intentions. I believe you and Mrs. Davies had some small dispute about your gardens. Barnes's chest deflated a little. Oh, that. Nonsense, really. A mere misunderstanding over a fence post. Hardly worth mentioning. I wouldn't have harmed her over it if that's what you're hinting at. Miss Marple said nothing, only gave her little nod. The nod that suggested she had heard exactly what she meant to hear. She knew better than to challenge further. People, when left to themselves, revealed more in their efforts to justify than under direct questioning. By afternoon, she had made her way to the schoolhouse, where Lydia Trent was correcting sums in a classroom that smelled of chalk and varnish. The young woman looked tired, her features drawn. Oh, Miss Marple, she said, setting down her pen. I hardly know how to go on. The children must not see me anxious, and yet my thoughts run in circles. Everyone whispers about the poisoning. Do they truly suspect me? My dear, said Miss Marple, seating herself primly on a school bench, it is the way of villages to suspect first those who are least secure. A tenant, a schoolmistress, a woman without family. It is easy to make you the scapegoat. That does not mean you waiting in her garden, turning his hat in his hands. Miss Marple, he said, I've been going round in circles. The poison was strychnine, a fact we've confirmed from the remains of the jam. It must have been introduced recently, but we've no sign of purchase in any chemist's shop. Someone either had it already or obtained it under false pretenses. Miss Marple's eyes lit. Strychnine, a most dramatic poison, rarely used for subtlety, more often for its speed. That tells us something, Inspector. Craddock looked dubious. Does it? To me it tells us only that someone had access. Not only access, Miss Marple corrected gently. It tells us that the killer relied upon Harriet consuming the jam almost at once. Strychnine does not lie dormant like arsenic. It works swiftly, and its bitterness is hard to conceal. Therefore the poisoner must have known precisely when Harriet would open that jar. Craddock frowned, meaning it was one of the people present at the tea. Exactly, said Miss Marple. And of those, only a few had opportunity to handle the jar before it reached the table. The inspector shook his head. You see patterns I don't, Miss Marple. But I'd be grateful if you'd continue to observe. You seem to know this village better than anyone. Miss Marple smiled, her needles already busy with a new row of stitches. It is only that I have spent a lifetime observing human nature, Inspector. People are very much like my knitting. One dropped stitch may seem insignificant, but in time it alters the whole pattern. One must watch closely, that is all. As he departed, she sat in her lamplit parlor, the shadows lengthening around her, the soft tick of the clock marking the moments. In her mind, the suspects arrayed themselves like figures upon a chessboard. Clara, anxious and covetous. Lydia, fearful and cornered. Barnes, defensive and contradictory. The Reverend, mild but oddly detached. All had motives, however slight. All had opportunities. Chapter 5. The Wrong Threads. The next day brought with it a certain restlessness in the village. The police had been seen again at Rosewood Cottage, carting away boxes, notebooks, and a ledger or two, and such signs of official industry never failed to stir St. Mary Mead into lively agitation. At the Bluebell Tea Room, where Miss Hartnell, Miss Weatherby, and Mrs. Price gathered to fortify themselves with seed cake and Darjeeling, conversation ran at a brisk pace. "I am convinced," declared Miss Hartnell, tapping her teaspoon against her saucer for emphasis, "that Clara Wilton is at the bottom of it. Didn't I say so from the very beginning? Always looking enviously at Harriet's possessions, always sighing over what she could never afford. Mark my words, she put her hand to that jam cupboard." "Nonsense," sniffed Miss Weatherby. "If you ask me, it was Lydia Trent. Plain as the nose on your face. Young women without prospects can be very dangerous creatures, especially when they think the world against them. Harriet had her cornered with that rent rise." Mrs. Price leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, if we're speaking frankly, I heard from my cousin's neighbor that Mr. Barnes once bought rat poison at the chemist's in Much Benham. Rat poison, mind you. That hardly looks innocent, does it?" Miss Marple, who had been sipping her tea with quiet politeness, raised her eyes and said mildly, "Rat poison is a very ordinary purchase for a man with an orchard, Mrs. Price. Rats will have the apples else. I should not think it very conclusive." The trio fell momentarily silent, rather abashed, before rallying to fresh speculations. Miss Marple, however, was not listening. Her mind was busy with another puzzle entirely, the ledger Inspector Craddock had mentioned in passing. Harriet, she knew, had kept meticulous accounts of her preserves, the jar she made, the sugar she purchased, the ribbons she used to tie the labels. Such records to most would seem tedious. To Miss Marple, they might conceal something most valuable. She decided, therefore, to take a small stroll past Rosewood Cottage that afternoon. Clara was at the gate, looking harried. The word suited her doubly, brimmed with tears. Miss Marple regarded her gently. Cruel, perhaps. But cruelty does not always lead to murder. Forgive me, Mrs. Wilton, but if Harriet had truly left her fortune elsewhere, might that not give others besides yourself cause to wish her gone? Clara faltered. Others? Who else could it concern? Miss Marple did not answer, merely patted her hand. But inwardly she reflected. Clara's insistence on her own peril was curiously self-centered. Sometimes, when people fear discovery, they speak as though the whole world's motives mirror their own. On leaving the cottage, she encountered Inspector Craddock once more. He had the look of a man carrying a weight he could not yet balance. "I've a lead at last, Miss Marple," he said. "We've been checking pharmacy records. A small bottle of strychnine was purchased at the Much Benham chemist's last month. Signed for as required by none other than Lydia Trent." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Indeed? And what reason did she give?" "For vermin, apparently. She said her lodgings were plagued with mice. The chemist recalls her clearly. It seems damning, doesn't it?" "Damning," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Or perhaps merely convenient." Craddock frowned. "You mean she may have been set up?" Miss Marple did not reply directly. "I only observe, Inspector, that when one finds a thread lying across the floor, one must ask who placed it there, and whether it belongs to the weaving at all." That evening, in her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reviewed the pattern thus far. Clara's fretful anxiety about money, Lydia's documented purchase of poison, Barnes's inconsistency over the jam, and the Reverend's vague detachment. Each was a thread, yet none seemed to knot together convincingly. The following morning she resolved to speak to Lydia herself. The young woman opened the schoolhouse door with eyes red from weeping. "I suppose you've heard," she said bitterly. "Inspector Craddock questioned me about—" Nearly came to blows over this very bush. Said it leaned over her side. Petty, really. He clipped a branch viciously. "Still, she's beyond complaining now, isn't she?" The words, delivered so bluntly, gave Miss Marple pause. A careless tongue, she reflected, could be more revealing than any confession. As the sun dipped low, she returned home and sat once more with her knitting. The village, she knew, had already chosen its villain in Lydia. Gossip was a ruthless weaver, and Lydia's thread had been caught fast. Yet Miss Marple, with her long habit of patience, saw the design differently. The pattern was too neat, the evidence too convenient. It was, she thought, as though someone had deliberately drawn their threads in the wrong direction, hoping the eye would follow. And Miss Marple, with her steady gaze, intended not to be misled. Chapter 6. A Tangled Skein. The cloud of suspicion that settled over Lydia Trent grew heavier with each passing day. By midweek, the whole of St. Mary Mead was speaking of her with a certainty that brooked no doubt. She had, after all, purchased strychnine. She had quarreled with Harriet over the rent. She was solitary, without family, and, to village eyes, not quite one of us. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price shook her head solemnly and said, "It's always the quiet ones, you know. You never think they'd have it in them, and then, well, it's the quiet ones who brood." Mr. Simons at the post office added knowingly, "The chemist vouched for it. Signed her name, didn't she? That's not hearsay, that's fact." Even Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on fairness, remarked that she had always thought Lydia a little too intense with her piano playing, a sure sign of nerves. Miss Marple, however, observed the rush to judgment with her usual calm. She sat one morning by her window, darning a stocking, while outside 2 village girls passed by, whispering Lydia's name as though it were already written in the court records. Miss Marple's lips pursed in quiet disapproval. She had named so boldly at the chemist's. It is a most unladylike kind of recklessness. Craddock sighed. You make it sound as though the evidence were planted deliberately. Do I? Miss Marple said mildly. Well, I have noticed that in gardening, and murder is very like gardening in its way, one must always ask who planted this seed, and who stands to profit from its growth. Craddock gave a half-smile despite himself. You'll have me questioning every turnip in the patch before this is done. Still, I can't deny you've been right before. Perhaps you're right again. That evening, Miss Marple took it upon herself to call at the schoolhouse. She found Lydia seated at her desk, staring hopelessly at a pile of unmarked papers. Her eyes were hollow with sleeplessness, her hands restless. I fear I shall be arrested at any moment, Lydia said in a low voice. I see it in everyone's eyes. They whisper when I walk by. I cannot endure it. My dear child, said Miss Marple gently, courage is often required of the innocent. You must trust that truth will make itself known. Tell me, the strychnine you purchased, what became of it? Lydia lifted her face, anguished. I still have it, locked away in my drawer. Inspector Craddock has seen it. If I had used it, would it still be there? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed, a most telling detail. It suggests that someone wished you to appear guilty, but not too guilty. They wished to cast a shadow, not to blot out the sun. That, Miss Trent, is clumsy work. Tears sprang to the girl's eyes. But who would do such a thing? Who would hate me so much? Miss Marple patted her hand. Not hatred, my dear, only necessity. The guilty must always seek to divert suspicion. And you, poor child, are convenient. But take comfort. Convenience is never enough. The truth has a way of knitting itself together, no matter how tangled the skein. Later, passions. Still, the Reverend had given her nothing solid to hold. At supper, Miss Marple spooned out a little rhubarb compote she had made herself. As she tasted the tart sweetness, her mind returned to Harriet's jam. Strychnine was bitter, notoriously so. It was one of the difficulties with using it in food. How then had Harriet not noticed? Unless the bitterness had been masked, not by sugar alone but by Harriet's own pride. She had praised her jam before others, laughing at Mr. Barnes's teasing. Pride had silenced her palate. She had been deceived not only by the poisoner but by herself. This was not, Miss Marple reflected, a crime of rage. It was a crime of calculation. And calculation rarely revealed itself in such an obvious purchase as Lydia's bottle of poison. No, the real criminal had chosen well, hiding behind the village's eagerness to see guilt in the most obvious quarter. The next day brought news that shook the village even further. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's door once again, his expression grim. Someone attempted to break into the schoolhouse last night, he said. The drawer where Lydia kept her strychnine was forced. Nothing was taken, but the attempt was clumsy enough to be noticed. Someone wanted it to look as though she were careless, perhaps? Or perhaps they intended to remove the evidence altogether. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Ah, that is most illuminating. You see, Inspector, this is exactly what I meant. The pattern is too bold, too obvious. Someone is weaving the skein so tightly around Miss Trent that they are beginning to tangle themselves. Craddock exhaled. Then you think she's innocent? Miss Marple gave her gentle smile. I think, Inspector, that she is not guilty. Innocence and guilt are not always opposites, you know. One may be foolish, frightened, even weak, and yet not guilty. The guilty party, I believe, is rather stronger than we imagine, and more clever. But cleverness, like pride, has a way of betraying itself. As the evening shadow squabble at the bird bath, for all the turmoil about her. What others saw as scandal, she saw as pattern, and pattern, if studied long enough, always revealed its design. It was on a cool morning, the sky pale with drifting clouds, that Inspector Craddock stopped by again. He looked worn, as though sleep had eluded him. I can't make it fit, he said without preamble, standing stiffly by Miss Marple's parlor window. If Lydia were guilty, she'd have destroyed the poison the moment Harriet died. Why keep it at all? Yet if she's innocent, why purchase it in the first place? The girl claims it was for a biology demonstration, but it seems thin. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Young ladies of her sort do not always act with perfect judgment, Inspector. She may have purchased it without considering how it would look. In truth, it is often the foolishly innocent who appear most guilty. They lack the guile to cover their tracks. Craddock sighed. You're suggesting someone is using her lack of foresight as cover for their own scheme. I should not dream of suggesting, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. But I do observe. And I observe that Miss Trent is far too obvious a scapegoat. Her eyes twinkled over her spectacles. Real wickedness, you know, is seldom content with such blunt tools. It is a thing of subtlety, of patience, rather like crochet work. Craddock gave a rueful smile. Then what do you see, Miss Marple? She paused, set down her knitting, and folded her hands. I see threads. A remark here, a gesture there. The little details that do not fit unless one looks closely. For instance, did you notice the Reverend's expression when Mr. Barnes made his tactless joke? He looked not shocked, but watchful, quite different. And Clara Wilton, she protests too much, don't you think? Reverend shook his head. I do not care much for sweet preserves. My wife used to make them in abundance, but since her passing I have not partaken. My digestion prefers plain fare. Another thread. For if he had not eaten Harriet's jam, he could not have been the intended recipient. Unless, of course, Harriet herself was the target from the very beginning. From the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly towards the high street. The school children passed her, chattering, and she caught Lydia's anxious figure at the edge of the playground. Poor child, worn thin by suspicion. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered instead on Clara Wilton, who emerged from the greengrocer's with a paper bag of apples. Clara spotted her and gave a nervous little start. Miss Marple, how are you today? Dreadful business, all this. I cannot sleep for the thought of it. To think Harriet might have been murdered under our very noses. Do you suppose it was meant for me? After all, I took tea there only the week before. Her voice trembled, her hands fluttered, and yet her eyes, sharp and darting, seemed to measure Miss Marple's reaction. "Why, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone full of sympathy, "one must not dwell too much on dreadful possibilities. You are safe enough, I think. And besides, you would never eat so much jam as Harriet herself. She was rather proud of her skill in that regard, was she not?" Clara's expression flickered. "Yes, yes, indeed. Always boasting of it. I dare say one could hardly taste anything else once she had set her jars out, though to my palate it was often too sweet." "Too sweet," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully as Clara hurried away. Another thread. That evening, Miss Marple invited her old friend, Mrs. Price Ridley, to tea. Over buttered scones and seed cake, she steered the conversation gently towards Harriet. "A pity, was it not?" Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "Pity? Well, only a deadly method, but a symbolic one." The next day brought a small but crucial discovery. Miss Marple, ever fond of small errands, stopped at the chemist's shop. After a polite inquiry about cold remedies, she remarked casually, "You must keep careful records of your purchases. Such responsibility." The chemist, a tidy man with pince-nez, adjusted his ledger. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Everything entered, every bottle accounted for. Why, even that strychnine purchased by Miss Trent. Quite in order." Miss Marple peered gently at the open page. "And has anyone else purchased such substances of late?" The chemist shook his head. "No, no. Only Miss Trent. Young lady seemed earnest enough." Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple's eyes rested not on the ledger, but on the blotter beneath. There, faintly, she saw the impression of another name, written and torn away. Not Lydia's neat hand, but something broader, heavier. Someone had tested a pen, perhaps, or practiced a signature. And someone had taken great care to remove the evidence. A dangerous thread, indeed. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, her knitting set aside, her thoughts weaving. The threads she had gathered were many. Lydia, too obvious, too clumsy to be truly guilty. Clara, protesting loudly, yet revealing sharp watchfulness beneath her flutter. Barnes, bitter, prideful, with his careless tongue. The Reverend, detached yet observant, his roses pruned with almost ruthless care. And through them all, Harriet's pride in her jam, the stage upon which this drama had played. Miss Marple leaned back, closing her eyes. The pattern was forming. It was not yet whole, but she could almost see it. A crime born not of hatred alone, but of envy, of rivalry, of someone's need to triumph. She smiled faintly to herself. The skein was loosening. One more tug and the whole design would reveal itself. Remained who had slipped it into the jar, and how. A sharp rap at the door broke her reverie. Inspector Craddock stood there, his face weary but intent. "Miss Marple, I've had word from the lab in town," he said as she ushered him in. "They've confirmed it. Strychnine in the jam. No doubt about it. Enough to kill within minutes once consumed in sufficient quantity. The puzzle is how it got there. The cupboard showed no signs of tampering. Miss Marple poured tea, her expressions serene. "Ah, that is the essence of the matter, is it not? The poison must have been introduced before the jar was sealed, or very carefully afterward. Harriet was not one to leave her kitchen unattended during such important work." Craddock sipped, frowning. "Then it must have been someone close enough to help her, someone she trusted in her kitchen." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, indeed." "And who might those persons be?" The inspector listed them. Clara Wilton was often about. Mr. Barnes came to mend the fence one afternoon, though whether he entered the kitchen I can't say. The Reverend occasionally visited to deliver parish notices. And Lydia, of course, lodged there. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Quite a little stage, isn't it? And each actor with their part to play. But one must always remember, the play is not performed for the audience, but for the benefit of the actor. Ask, who gained most by Harriet's silence?" That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to Rosewood Cottage. The gate still sagged where Mr. Barnes had once let it fall in temper. She lingered a moment, running her gloved hand along the latch, then moved on to the kitchen door, now locked but not barred to her thoughts. She pictured Harriet bustling about, proud as ever of her preserves. The big copper pan on the hob, the sugar weighed and measured, the fruit bubbling and spitting scarlet froth. Harriet would have chattered, no doubt, about her triumphs, about her. Mr. Barnes came in, complaining about the fence. He stood there, scowling, until Harriet gave him a spoon to taste. He made some remark, I forget what, and stormed out again. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "very illuminating." Later that day, Clara Wilton herself came calling, as though compelled to keep Miss Marple apprised of her suffering. She perched on the edge of the chair, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. "I cannot help but think, Miss Marple, that Harriet's death was meant as a warning to me," she said with a tremulous sigh. "After all, I was in and out of that cottage often. Suppose I had eaten that jam instead. I should be lying in the churchyard now." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "And yet you did not. Curious, is it not? Tell me, Clara, when you were last in Harriet's kitchen, what were you speaking of?" Clara's eyes darted. "Why, the harvest fair, I believe. She was boasting of her latest batch. I recall distinctly. She said none could match her. And I may have remarked that sweetness can be cloying if one is not careful. That is all." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she resumed her knitting later that evening, Clara's words echoing in her mind. Cloying. Too sweet. A telling choice of phrase. On Thursday, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the church bazaar. Reverend Chillingworth, calm and measured, presided with his usual detachment. Yet Miss Marple watched closely as jam was served upon scones. The Reverend declined, citing his digestion. Clara hesitated, then took a dainty spoonful, as though to prove her courage. Mr. Barnes grumbled about the stickiness and demanded more butter. Only Lydia refused, her face pale, her hands trembling. It was then that Miss Marple noticed something. Clara Wilton, so insistent upon her fear of poison, so quick to proclaim herself the possible victim, ate her spoonful of jam without the slightest curtain must rise on the truth. Might I suggest tomorrow afternoon at Rosewood Cottage? Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She folded the letter, sealed it, and smiled softly. The pattern was clear now, every thread in place. The bitterness had betrayed the hand that wielded it. Clara Wilton, with her fluttering airs and trembling protests, had thought herself clever. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, was never enough. In the end, human vanity always left its aftertaste. And Harriet Hargreaves, proud and boastful though she had been, would at last have justice. Chapter 9. The Gathering at Rosewood Cottage. The sitting room at Rosewood Cottage was heavy with expectation. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon sun, and the faint tick of the mantel clock seemed to echo louder than usual. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his arms folded, while the suspects assembled in various attitudes of unease. Lydia Trent sat stiffly in a wooden chair, her pale face composed but shadowed by fatigue. Beside her, Clara Wilton fanned herself with a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously about the room. Mr. Barnes stood near the window, his stout figure restless, fingers drumming irritably against the sill. The Reverend Chillingworth, calm as ever, sat with folded hands, his gaze downward, as though in prayer or meditation. Miss Marple, in her neat gray dress and lace collar, presided gently from her seat near the tea table. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles motionless. Though she seemed the least imposing presence in the room, all eyes turned toward her as she cleared her throat softly. "My dear friends," she began, her voice calm and precise, "I have asked you here because truth, like ivy, must eventually find its way into the light. Harriet Hargreaves, the loud and open kind. You are not one to slip powders into pans. Too blunt a weapon for you, I fancy." Barnes looked both relieved and affronted. "Reverend Chillingworth," Miss Marple continued, "you were sometimes received in Harriet's parlor, but you yourself have told me you avoided her preserves altogether. One does not poison a dish one never eats, unless to strike at the hostess herself. And you, I think, had no quarrel with Harriet, save the small vexations common to all parishioners." The Reverend inclined his head gravely. "That leaves Clara Wilton," Miss Marple said, turning her gaze. "You often visited Harriet in her kitchen, did you not? You have told me so yourself." Clara gave a little gasp. But I was only keeping her company. Harriet and I were friends, as much as anyone could be friends with Harriet. Surely you don't—" "Let us hold the thought for a moment," Miss Marple said serenely. "The question of motive. Motive, then. Harriet, though a generous hostess, was not without her faults. She was, I think we must all admit, rather proud. Her skill with preserves was her particular triumph, and she did not spare her neighbors her boasts. Mr. Barnes, you resented her for it. Lydia, you endured her criticisms in silence. Reverend, you passed it by with Christian forbearance. But Clara, you too made jams and jellies, did you not? At last year's harvest fair, Harriet bested you before the whole village. A small thing, perhaps, yet pride takes root in small soil. I have heard from Mrs. Price Ridley that you left the hall that day in tears. Clara's handkerchief fluttered faster. That was only embarrassment. Harriet was unkind. She laughed at my entry. But I bore her no malice, Miss Marple, I assure you. Perhaps not consciously, Miss Marple murmured. But envy, like strychnine, has a bitter aftertaste. And one may sweet trembling hands. But you betrayed yourself in one small thing. Clara's voice rose in shrill protest. No, it isn't true. I was afraid for my life. Harriet's jam might have killed me. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright as a bird's. And yet, my dear, you ate jam at the vicarage the other evening without the slightest hesitation. A woman truly terrified of poison does not do such a thing. It was not fear, but theater. And theater, you see, is always betrayed by its performance. The room was still. Clara's handkerchief slipped to the floor. The unraveling Inspector Craddock spoke quietly. Miss Wilton, do you have anything to say? Clara's lips moved soundlessly. Then, with sudden vehemence, she cried, She deserved it. She mocked me, all of us. Every fair, every gathering, she crowed over her jam as though it were a crown. She made me small before the village. I only meant to teach her a lesson. A little pinch, just to spoil the taste. I never thought. Her voice faltered. The room held its breath. But strychnine does not forgive lessons, Miss Marple said softly. It kills without discrimination. A bitter seed sown in pride, grown to bitter fruit. That is the truth of it. Clara's shoulders sagged. She sank into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his voice grave. Clara Wilton, I must ask you to accompany me. There was no struggle, only a faint broken sob as she rose and allowed herself to be led away. Let's said, aftermath. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Lydia's eyes brimmed with tears, half relief, half exhaustion. Mr. Barnes muttered something about damned fool women and their preserves, but his voice lacked conviction. The Reverend bowed his head in prayer. Miss Marple, serene as ever, gathered her knitting. Poor Clara, she said quietly. She was never wicked, not at heart. Counters of the high street shops. But already the village air felt lighter. At Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple sat at her familiar table by the window, her teapot steaming gently, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. The roses outside glistened with dew, nodding as if in approval of the day's freshness. There came a tap at the door. Lydia Trent entered, her figure still slim and a little fragile, but her face softer than it had been for weeks. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, the blooms bright against her dark dress. Miss Marple, she said with quiet warmth, I cannot thank you enough. If not for you, I should still be accused, perhaps even standing trial, and all for something I never dreamed of doing." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "My dear, you must not distress yourself. Injustice, you see, is rather like dust in a cottage. It settles quickly, and most unfairly where one least expects it. The important thing is to notice it and sweep it away, before it chokes the air. You were simply unfortunate to have strychnine in your keeping at such a time." Lydia gave a faint laugh. "Unfortunate is a mild word for it. I shan't keep such substances again, no matter how useful for biology demonstrations." "Very wise." Miss Marple nodded. "Poisons belong in nature's hand, not ours. Left alone, they are part of God's design. Misused, they are deadly." They sat together for a moment, sipping tea, the hush of morning wrapping them. A visit from Inspector Craddock. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock arrived at Rosewood Cottage. His boots tapped crisply on the path, and he entered with the brisk air of a man who had just closed a difficult case. Yet his expression softened when he looked at Miss Marple. "I've come to report, Miss Marple," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Clara Wilton has signed a statement. She admits tampering with the jam pan, though she insists she meant no more than to spoil the great wars, that many hearts are lost. You may study the history of empires if you like, but you will learn more of human nature from two women in a kitchen at harvest time." The inspector gave a short laugh. "I believe you're right. Well, I'll leave you to your roses. You've more than earned your peace. The village reacts." In the days that followed, the village returned slowly to its routine. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was overheard saying that she had always suspected Clara of having a temper, though in truth she had never said any such thing until now. The butcher confided to his customers that Harriet Hargreaves had been bound to come to a bad end, one way or another, though his memory of saying so before was somewhat doubtful. At the vicarage, Reverend Chillingworth spoke solemnly of envy during his Sunday sermon, drawing a moral lesson that made several parishioners squirm uncomfortably in their pews. Mr. Barnes, meanwhile, returned to his fence with renewed vigor, declaring that no woman's jam, poisoned or not, was going to keep him from his rightful bit of land. And Lydia Trent, once so pale and hunted, walked through the village with her head lifted again. Children smiled at her. Neighbors nodded politely. And though some still whispered, the sharp edge of suspicion was gone. A quiet afternoon. One afternoon, Lydia returned to Rosewood Cottage with a basket of scones she had baked herself. She and Miss Marple sat together, sharing them with clotted cream and strawberry preserves. "It is strange," Lydia mused, "how something as ordinary as jam can cause so much misery." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Ah, my dear, it is never the jam. It is always the hand that stirs it. Harriet's preserves were merely the stage upon which Clara's envy played its little drama. Human folly, you see, can turn the simplest things into tragedies." Lydia looked down at her plate. "Do you think the village will ever forget?" Miss Marple gave her a soft smile. "Villages never forget, my dear, but they do grow accustomed. In time your name will be linked more with your kindness than with any scandal. Harriet's jam will become a story for winter evenings, told with her garden." The evening air was sweet with the scent of roses, and a blackbird sang in the hedge. She bent to pull a small weed from among the blooms, her fingers gentle but firm. "One must never let them run riot," she murmured to herself. not in the garden, nor in life. And with that, she turned back into her cottage, her figure small yet steady, carrying with her the quiet wisdom that had once again brought peace to St. Mary Mead.